Hey guys, this is Glenn from the mediaTCgroup, and in this video, I'll show you how I manage and track project risk regardless if the project follows an Agile or Waterfall methodology. Before we dive into the approach, I'm building off from the Microsoft Excel file that I've been using for my previous video about creating a project dossier. I'll provide a link at the top if you want to explore that subject. So let's jump into the risk management topic. Risk register. I'm going to remove the grid lines. This is really more of a personal preference. Before we go ahead and create the headers, the labels that I'm going to be creating are based on best practices and the most used headers I've grown accustomed to when logging risk items. Risk identifier. Number. Action item ID. This column is linked to the Action Item tab in case one of the action items materializes into a risk to the project. This is entirely optional, so feel free to exclude it. Sprint. If you're managing your projects using Agile methodology, then it's ideal to have a column allocated for sprint. This has helped me in the past to determine which sprint iteration that the risk materialized. Description. This is the description of the risk. This is where you'll input the description of the risk. You can be as detailed as you need here. Risk status. Reason for risk closure. Risk category. Secondary risk. Date raised. Raised by risk owner. The risk owner can either be management or department who will own the risk. Risk actionee. The risk actionee is the person responsible for the risk. Probability. Impact. Residual risk. Comments. Let's go ahead and quickly format the table headers. Enable the wrap text feature. Since some of the column headers aren't mandatory, I'll go ahead and add a sub-label called if applicable. Let me clean up column N. I'm going to add another column that I completely missed called Date Closed. Let's continue with our column formatting, especially with the date field. It's important to take the extra step in establishing the date format convention. This way, when you're communicating with your stakeholders, you'll minimize any confusion when referring to either the year, month, or the day. So to minimize this, I format the cell to display the entire 4 digits for the year. This is beneficial when projects straddle between the back half of the year and continues its execution into the following year. As for the month, I use the 3-letter convention. The next step is to format the table using the Format As table, so that all the cell formatting, like the date fields, wrap texts, formats remain intact. Here's a link to a separate video where I explain in detail how I utilize the Format As table feature. But for this tutorial, I'll just go ahead and configure the table formatting. Next up, I'm going to pre-populate the risk identifier with the risk label. Now, this is just personal preference. I like to keep risk identifier label on a separate column from the unique identifier number. As for the risk number, I usually go ahead with 3 digits for the risk item. Action Item ID. As mentioned, if an action item that was logged in the Action Item tab materializes into a risk item, then this field provides the traceability back to the source, allowing you to follow up appropriately with the appropriate stakeholders. Sprint. I'll explain that one later. Description. This is where you'll input the description of the risk. You can be as detailed as you need here. Make sure wrap text is enabled. As for risk status, I create a pick list for this. I'll add the list of values in the Values tab where I keep all the various types of lists. In the case of risk status, it's either active or closed. Here's a link to a separate video where I explain how I utilize data validation feature to allow the user to select a standardized list of values. We'll create a pick list for the column Reason for Risk Closure. The first is Risk Impacted, Managed as an Issue. As the description indicates, it's an identified risk that's become an issue. Next, risk did not occur. Risk successfully managed. Let's verify that our pick list is working. Yes, it does. Next, we're going to create the pick list from the risk category. The risk category that we'll be creating comes from the Management of Risk, a guide for practitioners. An effective technique that I've used for many years when uncovering the sources of risk and a particular type of risk is to refer to a risk breakdown structure. It organizes and defines an organization's activities. It's important to note that the categories and the lists within each is not an exhaustive list, so feel free to add your own based on your organization's business activities and objectives. The categories and the list I'm about to share have been my go-to list when I manage technology projects across pharmaceutical, telecommunications, financial, government, and biomedical sectors. If you're following along and building your risk category list, I've included the list that I'm typing up right now in the description below, so feel free to copy and paste it into your Excel document. Once you've identified a risk category, you should also identify and describe any secondary risks that may exist. This will help you and your team formulate a comprehensive risk response plan. In a future video, I'll walk you through the techniques that I use to develop a risk response plan that will enable timely decision making for your project and your stakeholders to meet program or project objectives. Let's go ahead and link the risk breakdown structure to the risk category column. A quick test shows that our list is now linked as a drop-down menu. We'll do the same thing for the secondary risk column. Let's jump back to the Values tab and create list of values for priority. To keep things simple, I use low, medium, and high. We're going to use this list of values and link it to the probability column. We'll connect the same list as well to the impact column. Before I forget, I'd like to add another link to program risk column. I use this column header to reference a risk that the program level may have identified along the way. The linked to program risk column allows for traceability with your project to the program level. Or, put in another way, it helps highlight the cause and effect. This only applies if your project is linked to a larger program. So whether you're working on an Agile or a Waterfall project, this video demonstrates how a risk register is used to capture risk items resulting from uncertain events that would impact your project's objectives in a negative way. Join me next time where I unlock more project management time-saving tips. This is Glenn from the mediaTCgroup, and thanks for watching until the end.